Hello, everybody. I wanted to record a video, and I'm going to be very, very aware at the pace at which I'm speaking on this one due to the subject matter, which is the 80-20 of nonverbal communication. So let me get started on this. Okay. Oh, God, that's not what I want at all. I'm just going to leave this here. Okay, so let's get started. I want you guys to think of a situation where you had an interaction with someone. And I want you to think of a situation where you felt right and you wanted to move forward with that person, whatever that interaction may be. Maybe it was business, maybe it was personal. And I want you to think of a separate situation where it felt wrong. And for the people that are skeptics out there, I want to sort of impress on you that there is a really real biological basis for the reason of doing this. And just a disclaimer for the skeptics on this. I actually did my undergrad in this. I have a bachelor in psychology for management. I studied at McGill University, which is like one of the bigger places since the turn of the century for neuroscience research. And one of the things that I took, probably my favorite class in the entire major that I took, was something called animal learning and theory. And we're going to get into that in a little bit because I found more stuff relevant for that, for the applications that I found in business and sales specifically, than almost anything else. So I'm going to dive into that stuff a little bit more specifically. So this is a stat that you may have seen trotted out. It gets taken out, it gets put out there a lot, and there have been some debates like any study out there, but basically these are the elements of personal communication. This is the kind of stuff that some of the top salespeople in the world, some of the people who speak from stage for tons and tons of money deal with, and it's basically the elements of personal communication. So a lot of times people will focus on spoken words, especially attorneys, because you guys are paid for your command over spoken and written words. But it's actually a pretty small percentage based on the total picture, according to this study at least, and a lot of things that have corroborated similar stats. But basically there's spoken words, there's the voice and tonality, and there's body language. Now, obviously, body language isn't something that is going to come into play unless you're on a Zoom or you're in person. But, at the time of us recording this, we are in April 19th, 2021. So a pretty solid chance that a lot of us are going to be getting back to a little bit more in-person interaction soon. But basically, these are the elements. So nonverbal communication is what makes up that 38 plus 55%. And if you kind of notice this, there's situations where you can say words or trip over them. The words themselves aren't that good, but you can actually end up winning the interaction regardless because you have such strength in the voice, the tonality, and the body language. And I want you to think back to that exercise we just did a minute or two back, right? The situation where you're feeling right about something, a lot of the times it's determined in this little, not this little, this very big slice of how you feel about somebody is determined by these things, right? Even if the words they're speaking are perfect, or the opposite if it's a bad situation. And I want to sort of have you guys mentally overlay this with, this is kind of the neurological basis for this, right? So we technically have three major areas of the brain. And basically, there's the prefrontal cortex, and the cortex is the big wrinkly part on outside of your brain. But the prefrontal cortex is the one that's associated with decision making. Words of all kinds exist in the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system, or the mammalian brain, is responsible for emotions, memory, and that kind of old stuff too. So most of your amygdala, the fear, which a lot of people know is kind of the emotional or the fear part of your brain, that's in the limbic system. And then the reptilian brain regulates stuff like blood pressure, and you wouldn't even really be able to deal with this if you want. This is your brainstem basically. But basically, we have the 7% that's words that is going to live in the prefrontal cortex, and we have the 55 plus 38% that determines emotions, which deals with the limbic system, right? So anything that we're doing when we're talking about nonverbal communication is with the goal of affecting someone's limbic system, right? And again, this maybe sounds like mind control or something like that. It's absolutely not. But basically, it's really, really hard. And the thing is, you can always point to something, oh yeah, the customer said this, the customer said that, or the person I was interacting with said this, or the person I was interacting with said that. But the difference between what's being verbalized and what's being felt is really the difference between these two different parts of the brain. And overall, just head back for a bit. If you have a situation where somebody ticks the box from spoken word, but they don't tick the box from how somebody feels, they're not going to move forward with you. That's pretty much it. So what it behooves you to look into this stuff, because this is what you can basically have happen, right? So the other thing I want to kind of bring into is that there's sort of a feedback loop. So if we have a situation, and this stuff all, we're going to get into this in a little bit, but basically if you have a situation where somebody gets a bad feeling about you, it's easy to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If somebody's, and this is very, very important to start interactions the correct way, because on the flip side, if somebody has a good feeling about you, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the positive direction, which means, oh, I knew this guy was worthwhile. I knew this guy was trustworthy. I knew I wanted to do business with this person, right? And just kind of, I'm gonna have a little bit of fun with this. I really was enjoying searching for the photos for this, but since we're speaking about the mammalian brain, I want to talk about a mammal that most of you guys should be familiar with. At least you've seen a couple of these at some point in your life. I was absolutely fascinated. I mentioned earlier that the animal learning and theory was one of my favorite classes that I took, and one that I found a lot of application in. But if you guys ever watch stuff like The Dog Whisperer, Cesar Millan, that kind of stuff too, these are the concepts that work on dogs, but a lot of times they work on humans too. So I want to kind of illustrate a situation. If you guys have ever owned a dog, if you guys haven't owned a dog, there's a situation where you're bringing a dog to the park. And I mean, I'd be really shocked if you guys haven't ever seen an interaction like this before. But basically the dog's going to go into the park, and then all the other dogs are going to go check that dog out, right? And this is happening on some level every single time you meet somebody. There's parts of your brain, and you might not be able to verbalize it unless they're a sicko like me and decided to study this stuff. They're probably not going to be able to verbalize it either. But pretty much people are determining where the animal version of them stacks up to the animal version of somebody else. And you can see this and play out in situations where you have somebody getting steamrolled in negotiation or is steamrolling somebody else. You get a feeling for the status of somebody based on some of these interactions, right? And there's a couple different ways that we can go on this, right? One of the things I want to kind of point out is that the goal is not to be like the big dog, right? You don't want to be this dog on the right over here, because if you're coming out super hard, and there's basically two ways you can kind of mess this up. So let me rewind a little bit. So on the left, we have a situation. Now this is submissive dog behavior. I used to have a French bulldog, and he was not a tough dog whatsoever. So whenever he would go to the dog park, he would just roll over on his back and make a goofy face to let people know he wasn't a threat. This is the situation where you've lost control of the call, right? You are coming off as subservient. You're coming off as somebody who doesn't have power in the negotiation or power in the sales conversation. And ultimately, even if you have some very, very flowery language that you're using to describe things, you're not coming off as the expert. Ultimately, what this reads off of is, I'm not someone that you can trust because I'm not in control. And then, this is also plays in really, really tightly. This is huge crossover with the whole leadership conversation that we've been having in regards to sales and other videos. On the flip side, you don't want to be the super dominant one in the conversation, because you go from I'm not somebody you can trust to you're not somebody you can trust. If you ever have situations where you have buyer's remorse, this is a lot of times from this kind of a situation. So if you come across as too domineering, too alpha, too superior to somebody like that, they're going to either tune you out, or sometimes if they do go along with whatever you're doing, they're going to regret it afterwards, and it's going to be a very unpleasant client interaction moving forward. So you don't also want to be the big dog here. The best situation is you want to be the equal dog, right? You guys want to be an adult talking to an adult. You have authority, they have authority. You have the authority to tell them what is important about the situation they came to ask you about. They have authority to make the decision of what to do with their life. And that's the best situation, because they're going to, if you're giving somebody the confidence to move forward with something like that, while simultaneously giving them the confidence in you. So overall, like kind of goals with this, and we're going to get into the actual nitty gritty in a little bit, but basically level one is not losing deals. We've had situations, and this is training that we do internally at CaseFuel with the ISA team, with our sales team, reviewing my old calls. And I'll go into some situations that I used to mess this up in a little bit of a couple slides. But there's situations where you can lose deals by messing up one of these nonverbal things. And yeah, whatever, I'll spoil this one. So one of the subjects we're going to go into is the physical movements. And this is really interesting. I had a situation where I was doing a partnership deal. This was years ago. And it was getting to the time where we were closing the deal, which is a very, very important part, because people are honing in on these nonverbal cues very intensely at this point. So the person ended up being a later conversation situation, I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And then after the fact, I had the person who was like our technical expert for the call. He basically said, I saw the reason that you lost that deal, Jan. And I was like, what do you mean? So he goes, right after you named the price, You went ahead and you adjusted your glasses. And I was like, there's no way that actually lost the deal. But he's like, no, it really did. Because that is that's self-conscious behavior. It's like preening or, touching yourself, touching your face, that kind of thing. It means that you're not confident in what's happening. And even if that person wasn't able to verbalize it, in that moment, you came across as somebody who didn't really believe in the price point that you just did across. And I never spoke to that guy yet. So I ended up losing that deal. So pretty much level one, if you know these things, you're going to know the pitfalls to avoid. So you're not going to be losing deals. Level two, and I actually do have an itch on my nose, so don't take this as me not believing it, but okay. Anyway, level two is being immune to bad days. So sometimes you have a situation where you can be underslept. Maybe you had an argument with somebody, maybe you got some bad news and whatever, and then you come into with low energy, right? And if you have low energy, but you know how to not represent having low energy, you're not going to be falling into that cascade effect, right? Because if you come in and you're low and you're the dog who's coming in with their head down, their tail between their legs, then you're going to lose deals. You're not going to be in control of the conversation, and that's going to be bad. But if you know how to represent how a confident person would be, then you're not going to have those bad days. And level three, this is what to aspire to, is to win deals that you wouldn't otherwise. And this is going on to the positive side of things, because basically if you have a situation, to be completely frank, it's like the reason why people behave this way unintentionally is because they're representing where the actual, position is relative, right? If you haven't closed a deal in 6 months, you need that deal, but it's going to be a really good situation if you don't act like you need it, because if you need it, then you're going to have that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you need the deal, but you don't need the deal, then you're going to be able to come off and actually win the deal, ironically. So a lot of the situations, that's good. On the flip side, if you absolutely are representing that you have all the power and the conversation coming off is very, very strong, you can get a positive effect that would cause you to win a deal that you wouldn't otherwise, right? I'm sure you guys can think about somebody in your market who's some, young upstart, got a great goal, and they're closing deals with bigger clients than you should, or they're closing with the higher net worth people, and they probably don't deserve it. They're probably not doing good work as you. Probably a reason why this is happening is that these people are communicating in some level that they have the expertise to do something, even regardless of whether they do or not, right? I'm not saying that's how things should be, but it's an option that you can have when you are taking control of this kind of thing. Okay. And another thing I want to kind of start off before we get into the actual tips is this concept of rapport building versus rapport seeking. So this is just kind of a wrapper that we're going to look at for all of these different examples of things that you can do to control your nonverbal communication. One of the situations, so rapport building is something that is a huge benefit for any conversation. You want to be able to converse with somebody, because otherwise you're going to be talking to a brick wall. You're going to be getting one-word answers. It's not going to be very good. Rapport seeking, on the other hand, is whether you need the conversation to continue, which comes across as low value behavior. So we're going to use this in a couple different examples as we go through these other things. But overall, if you're the person who needs the conversation more, you're going to be demonstrating lower status, and you're going to be losing leadership within the call. So let's just keep this in mind as we kind of go through some of these. Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is cadence and speed. So this is actually something that I struggled with a ton in, especially my early career when I was doing tech sales. So I don't know if you guys have heard me, just when I get animated on things, I tend to speak very fast. I grew up on the East Coast. I listen to my podcasts on double speed. Sometimes I'll have a situation where I come off of having listened to podcasts on double speed all day, and I start talking really, really fast, because that's just what's been in my head the entire time, right? But that's a really bad thing to do. So basically, when you have a slow cadence, it calms people. It brings the energy level down in a really good way. On the flip side, when you're speaking quickly, it comes across as rapport seeking, because why are you speaking quickly? People speak quickly because they're afraid that the other person's going to start talking, right? And if you're so concerned about getting your point across, it means that you're not confident that you have the control of the conversation that you need. And again, going back to that feedback effect, if you're not, if you start speaking fast, you can actually create a situation where you don't have control over the conversation. So pay attention to your cadence and your speed when you're talking to people. The slower, the better. I also have noticed this too. And if you guys ever have the opportunity to record your consultations, and again, check with the bar and the legality of all that kind of stuff too. Don't, not a compliance lawyer, but basically if you ever get a chance to watch these on the way back, really pay attention to it. every single time. And I know this mostly from my old sales days, and we still record almost every sales presentation that we do. But if you go back as far to the point where I was doing them, that and also my podcast as well, you're almost always speaking faster than you are in your head. So my kind of like meta tip for this is speak in a way that feels uncomfortably slow, and you'll probably be speaking at a normal pace. Corollary on this, dealing with silence. So how fast you are to start a conversation is a huge indicator of rapport seeking behavior or not, right? So if you're comfortable with the silence, you're the person who is okay with the conversation not moving forward. You're not seeking rapport. So, and this becomes super, super important at the close. Obviously, everything that we're talking about here is magnified 10 times when you're naming a price. But in the course of the conversation, whenever you're asking somebody a question, don't cut them off. Whenever there's a little bit of a lull in the conversation, try not to be the one to jump in. I swear, if you end up just trying this in conscious, any of these things are things that you can focus on individually. But if you're letting other people fill the silence, it's very rare. I think a lot of the times too, especially if you're a person who has been used to speaking quickly all of your life, try it out. You'll be surprised about how often other people are going to fill the silence. And technically, every single time you do it, I like to think about it as just kind of like a little mini gambit, right? If you let the silence hang and they fill it in, you're sort of gaining points in that conversation, even if it's very, very subtle. Secondly, this is one of my favorites, and I'm going to link a video to this under our whatever this CaseFuel University, you get the idea. But inflection. So inflection is how your voice goes at the end of a sentence, right? So you may have noticed, I don't know when I started paying attention to this, but it's just kind of automatic for me at this point. But inflection is like, every single time I end a sentence is usually in a down note. So basically when you're making a statement, or you're making a statement that could be interpreted as a question, inflection would be upwards. So let's kind of think about something. Let's take something about like, an opening statement. Hey, I'm really excited for you to be here, versus I'm really excited for you to be here. That's kind of inflection. That comes off as eager. A lot of times too, with asking a question too, like, so tell me about, so could you tell me about your finances? That's upward inflection. So tell me about your finances, downward inflection. Upward inflection comes off as rapport seeking. And a lot of times it's going to have some effects on basically making, again, anything that we're talking about here is about the positive and negative feedback loop. So pay attention. It's super interesting too. Like, this is something that I've noticed a ton on our own team internally. And it's really funny. We go over old calls sometimes. We go, okay, the upward inflection there, this is where you lost the call. Downward inflection here, good. Downward inflection here, then you went back into it. So it's something you have to stay on guard for. But pretty much you want to make sure that you're speaking on a downward slope. Like, if you kind of graph the notes of what you're doing, this is going to sound really weird. But when you start practicing this, it's very easy to get this automatic, but it comes across as authoritative. It comes across as leadership. It comes across as somebody you can trust. Tip 3, physical movement. So I already went into, I'm going to skip this one, but specific movements to avoid, but physical movement. When you're on a Zoom call or you're in a conversation with somebody, it makes a lot of, like, you want to be as still as possible, right? If you're bouncing around, if you're, fidgeting, whatever, blah, 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 like moving your hair, touching yourself, blah, 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 all this different stuff. You guys probably got a little bit uncomfortable watching me do that, to be honest. But basically, if you're kind of bouncing around, it comes across as not being comfortable. When you're not comfortable, you're going to make somebody else not comfortable. And it's also just going to be looking at somebody that, it's not trustworthy. Why are this person? The word shifty in the English language literally refers to this, right? So wherever possible, you want to be steady, you want to be slow with everything from your voice all the way down to your physical movement. Specific movements to avoid. So I already went through some of these, but these are just basically some movements that come across as very insecure are movements that are, they're basically referred to collectively as like preening gestures, right? So if you're a guy touching your beard, this is something my girlfriend notices about me all the time. Whenever I'm like nervous driving or something like that, I start scratching my beard under my neck. But that's because I'm uncomfortable. But in general, it's basically, touching your glasses, touching your nose, fixing your hair, all that kind of stuff too. Because the reason why it's very natural to do that is because you're thinking about yourself. And you might not even know this, but you want yourself to come up across as better. And basically, but it focuses on, if you're fixing your hair, it's so you can look good. If you're preening yourself, that's all this thing is. This is a very natural reaction that people have. This will absolutely kill you on a close. And elsewhere, it's going to be kind of a downwards look. It's just like, I don't know, you guys will start noticing this. A lot of the things with these things that we've gone over here are things that once you learn these, you can't unsee them. So sorry about that, but you're going to notice this too. When you have a situation where you're talking to somebody or interview or something like that, you can basically gauge how nervous somebody is by how much they're, touching their face, fixing their hair, touching their eyelashes, whatever, right? So just avoid those. Those are like specific movements to definitely avoid. And tip 4 is going to be question selection. So I was kind of on the fence about whether to include this or not, because it is sort of a verbal thing, but basically the actual content of the questions you ask is going to be the actual questions. But what questions are you going to select? And I'm probably going to do an entire other video on this, but basically the more of at any given time, you have the option to select questions that are super, super softballs ranging to pretty extreme questions. So if you're asking somebody like, look, what's your end goal? Like, what do you want to do? What do you want to have in your money after you die? Like, that's a really intense question. But there's a point in the conversation where you can ask that question. Again, I probably wouldn't recommend opening up with it, but basically for the interaction that you're having, for the person that's sitting across the table, and for all the context leading up to this, you have a range. And the more that you have these consultations and the more you're paying attention to this kind of stuff, you're going to get a feel for what the range is. So going back to the concept of rapport seeking, a softball question may come across as rapport seeking behavior. A harder question is rapport breaking behavior, which is strong. And I should probably go back and edit that slide because it's rapport seeking versus rapport breaking. But basically, if you're having breaking rapport and the person's catching up to you, right? That's the same thing as when you're having a pregnant silence and letting them follow up, right? The more of those questions you ask, the more you're building up your esteem and leadership within the conversation too. But at the same time, it's not in a way that's at their expense, right? Because you're also giving them an opportunity to speak of themselves. So you're just kind of building your collective feeling as two adults in the conversation higher when you're doing that. So last thing too, I just want to get into, and again, we just went over just 4 quick tips. And again, I think the concepts might be a little bit more important than the specific stuff. You can focus on any of these things at a time. My situation where, like, when I'm working on this stuff, and again, there's applications of this for management if you have a team, that kind of stuff too, but this is all just interpersonal stuff that you can use. The video that I'm going to link before this goes over, funny enough. I sent this to the team. Charlotte ended up using this for getting her kids to do stuff around the house. I swear to God, it's that powerful. But basically the effects of this over a long period of time. So like I said in the beginning, the reason why a lot of these behaviors are natural is because it reflects where you are in the moment, right? If you have a situation where you absolutely need a deal to close, then it's going to come across if you don't pay attention to this, right? The big positive or negative effect on this is that when you have this working out and you're closing more deals, you're not going to have to fake it anymore. If you get to the point where you're closing $20,000 worth of retainers a week, or $20,000 worth of trust and estate plans per week, then you're not going to have to fake feeling good because you're just going to actually feel good. On the flip side, if you have a situation where you're in the dumps, it's going to actually lead you to the point where you're going to have lower status in conversation because you will need that, right? So one of the big reasons why, not only within the context of an individual consultation, but the more that you can have a command over this, the more it's going to tip the scales into having you actually be able to consolidate that and make more money in your practice, right? At the end of the day, we don't want to have to fake this stuff. But sometimes being able to fake it in the short term is going to make it real in the long term. So I want you guys to just kind of think on that for the last, and again, let me know if you have any questions and go out there and try some of this stuff out.